This Choircast podcast episode is brought to you by the book Letting Go, How I Failed Gay Conversion Therapy and Learned to Love Myself by Aaron Simnowitz. In this book, I take the reader on my journey as I navigate the controversial divide between the evangelical church and homosexuality. This book gives readers just one example of a life that was tortured by gay conversion therapy and how it is possible to come out on the other side of self-acceptance. You can pick up this book at Amazon.com right now.
Liminal, a word 1,000 miles wide but small enough to fit into the present moment. It describes an in-between place. We live most of our lives within this space, not quite ever arriving at our idealistic final destination. We spend so much of our energies on our best impersonation of who we wish we were, until we can't. But in sneaks a dark night of the soul, or perhaps a mystical experience. Our way of being has an error loop introduced. Today we call that deconstruction. Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast, where we teach you how to be here, how to traverse these spaces, and where we can go if we remain humble, open, and honest. Well, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. I am your curator of conversations, Tom Rundell. And today I have the pleasure of sitting down with Danny Cox, a newfound friend and a wonderful human being. Now, Danny is a musician, a pastor, and the founder of something called the Open Table Collective. And Danny's journey has taken him from a life of music, where he was actually signed with Atlantic Records and touring in a band, to this transformational experience that led him into ministry in one of the largest churches in Metro Detroit. And over the years, Danny has developed a deep passion for fostering inclusive spaces of conversation, especially through his work with Open Table Collective. And this initiative focuses on creating a welcoming community that encourages dialogue across cultural, religious, and social boundaries, lifting up marginalized voices and nurturing love and justice among the people. And in our conversation today, we explore Danny's personal story, his evolution of faith, his transition from the evangelical church to embracing a broader spiritual journey, including the challenge of creating spaces where all people, regardless of identity, feel truly seen and truly welcomed. And we dive deep into his work with the LGBTQ plus community, his thoughts on radical inclusion in the church, and how the Open Table Collective is redefining what it means to gather and grow in faith. This conversation with Danny is just really rich with insights, but more so than that, I think the humanity of Danny is really going to touch your heart. Our conversation was very gracious. He's a gracious individual. He really shows us what it looks like to embody and truly live out an inclusive faith. So I can't wait for you to hear this conversation with Danny Cox. So without further ado, this is my conversation, and enjoy. Well, Danny Cox, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. It is good to see your face on my computer today. How you doing?
Yeah, good to see you too. It's nice to put a face to the voice. And I'm grateful to be with you today. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, well, we have a mutual friend, Jason Rates. He's been on the podcast. And he's like,
Jason's amazing.
You need to meet my friend Danny. And I was like, I think I do. And I went and friended you on Facebook, and I've been following you like covertly. And then I did the pounce on him, like, come on the podcast. So,
and I jumped right on it. So it was great.
Did. Yeah, we had a fun conversation a couple weeks ago about what we could do. And I was like, gosh, we could go anywhere that we want to go. It's going to be fun. So where do you find yourself in the world today?
That's a big question.
I was talking geographical. We'll get into deep stuff later.
Not a philosophical.
No.
I am in my studio in Sterling Heights, Michigan, and they do a lot of recording here. I'll do a podcast here as well, but I also do some music recording and do all my kind of work down. Usually I'm relegated to a place that has no windows and no natural light.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I've spent most of my life there,
The cave.
The fluorescent tan.
Oh, yeah. Gosh. The fluorescent lights. I can't do it anymore. Like, there is like a flicker that is so subtle, and I can't do it anymore. I switched over to LEDs, and it's been a lot better.
I get you.
All right. So you are in a studio. So does that mean like a studio for podcasts, music? What do you do in this studio?
Yeah, I do just a bit of everything. I grew up as a musician, and I did that for a big part of my career, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that. But So I've always had a little bit of a recording studio in my home, probably since I was in my early 20s, my mid 20s. And so I still have a music studio, and then I kind of converted part of this little space into a podcast and, podcasting studio. So a little bit of everything.
Nice. Well, that's cool. That's cool. Well, you kind of run this Open Table Collective, and I want to get into what that is and what you do. But first, I want to know a little bit more, like, who are you? What are the roots, or what is the soil that your roots have grown out of to bring us the Danny we see before us today?
Yeah, I grew up in this general area. I was born in Pennsylvania, but moved here pretty quickly after. I was actually born on the Black Day in July. It was the day of the riots in Detroit. So July 23rd, 1967, and so that's been an interesting connection to be in Detroit and be born on the day of those that particular tension in our community. And so, my parents grew up Catholic, and so our whole childhood was spent in the Catholic Church, going to catechism, going through all the sacraments, being confirmed in the church. And I have two brothers as well. And so that kind of took up my childhood. And we were more Creasters than anything, Christmas, Easter. But we were meant to go every week, every Saturday to catechism, which, when I look back now, at the time, it was just torture. The last thing you want to do on a Saturday morning is go to another class, But I'm really grateful that my mom pushed for that and really gave us a foundation in that. Yeah. And interestingly enough, as I was growing up Catholic, there was a profound moment that I didn't realize how profound it was, that when I entered 6th grade, there was a public teacher named Mr. Ritchie. There were two classrooms. There was Mr. Ritchie and Mr. Kenny Barr. And Mr. Ritchie took all the trouble kids, and Mr. Kenny Barr took all the smart kids. And we kind of knew that. And I was a bit of a troubled kid. And my mom came to me one day and said, "Hey, I'm going to put you in Mr. Ritchie's class." And I was just really pissed off. I thought, why am I with the bad kids, Well, about a day into that class, this guy came, and he was a huge guy, probably 6'5", 250 pounds, worked out. He wore crazy colored suits that matched his crazy colored Cadillacs. He was just a really eccentric guy. But he came to me and he said, "I'd like you to come to a Bible study in the morning." This was in public school in the 70s. And I said, "Really?" And okay. And he goes, "Go home and ask your mom." So I went home and asked my parents. My mom said, "Yeah, I think you should do that." And as a little kid in 6th grade, I just made my way in the morning to his classroom. And I'll never forget the first day of that classroom. He stood up before us. He probably had a dozen kids in there. And he stood before these young men and he said, "Okay, let's start at the beginning." And he just opened up his Bible and he started reading from Genesis. And I still have a profound passion for Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. Those scriptures are some of the most important to me. And that year transformed my life. He really walked me into a transformation. And I had a huge fro. I know you can't imagine it, but I just had a massive head of hair. And by the end of that year, I was physically transformed. He was the only one that could cut my hair. He took me to get a cut at the barber shop, and it was a really profound thing. So that combination of the Catholic Church, and he was Baptist. And at the end of that year, I gave my life to Christ. And so I had this really interesting kind of combination of faith in my youth.
You kind of got that Catholic tradition, spiritual, and then you got that kind of the strong point of the evangelical church has always been like just kind of meeting the people where they're at in their psychology. What we do with that sometimes, can be a little shady here and there, but
absolutely.
That has probably contributed to the success of the evangelical church in America, as it kind of it tries to shed that traditional stuff and just get at you where you are, and that really speaks the language of the people, especially during the 60s and the 70s in that era.
Oh, no question. And I didn't really understand at that point any of that kind of stuff. I just knew that there was this guy that showed interest in me, and he really loved me in a way that was different than anybody. And he became one of the best friends of our family. We were tight all the way until he passed away. But yeah, it was a really formative time. And of course, I got out of 6th grade and wandered And, we still were creasters. We weren't going all the time, but I still wandered through things. But I think that when I look back now, that was just such a beautiful moment where God entered into my life at a time where I certainly needed it, and through a person. And so that was just gorgeous. It was a gorgeous experience.
Yeah. And then you kind of found your way into like the pastoral realm. How did you get to that place?
Well, it's interesting what happened. I wandered through, all of my schooling, and then I got out of school when I was about 17. And by the time I turned 18, I was a full-time musician artist. And the band I was with got signed to Atlantic Records. And we started touring and go around the world, around the country. And it was interesting what happened because I started wandering away from Christianity at that point, and I always say I studied every ism, Sufism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Course in Miracles, atheism, objectivism, Ayn Rand stuff, all kinds of different things, just trying to find truth. And interestingly enough, in those years, I was working alongside so many different musicians. So I was working alongside different cultures, different ethnicities, different sexualities. All of that was kind of birthing in me. And so it was sort of, there's a theory that your life converges and emerges in certain times. And I think that's really important for people to take note of, because it's not something that happens all the time, but there are seasons that come and converge on each other, and all of a sudden something new emerges. And that was really throughout my 20s and early 30s was a formative time to see all of the world and see all of these different kind of religions and ethnicities and identities coming together, and me falling in love with different people, and really getting close, and a lot of friendships. And along with that, I got married late in my 20s, had a couple little kids, and then along with that, I really struggled with a lot of mental struggles, a lot of really deep depression, anxiety, those kinds of things for a big chunk of my life, from my earliest memories. And so by the time I got to my early 30s, all of that kind of converged on itself. And it was a pretty dark place. I was in a pretty tough place. I had been hospitalized a couple times. I was on a medication. And I just happened to get an invite to come and play some of my music at a church. And I walked into this church. It's a big old church called Kensington Church. And when I walked in the door, I walked in with a friend, and I was like, man, this place is a cult. And she looked at me and she's like, yeah, this place is a cult, But they were paying me to play, and the thing that I noticed was the people. They were just so kind and thoughtful. And, and I had played a bunch of dingy bars all over the world, and so this was a nice little place, and they treated well, and so it's beautiful. And then after I did that, this was January of 2000. After that, they invited me to come play Christmas. And I was like, well, I'll do it if you pay me. You pay my rate, I'll do it.
Good answer.
And they did. And so I went and played. And it was really great. The musicians were quite good, which I was surprised about. And I didn't know if that would be the case in the religious world. But we were having a good time, and they said, hey, you need to go out and listen to the message. And I had no interest. I was studying Buddhism at the time. I had no interest in Jesus. But by the end of the first day of services, because I think they had like 50 million services, I don't know. Yeah. And I went out and listened to it. And I was sitting underneath an exit sign in the back of this hallway, this aisleway. And the pastor kept saying, God is calling you home. God is calling you home. God is calling you home. And I had written a song called Coming Home based off of the poet that I love, Jalaluddin Rumi. And that was a theme that was in my life at that point. And Jalaluddin Rumi was the first person that ever put into words what my heart felt. Because he wrote this poem called This Longing, and Coleman Barks interpreted it into English language and explained it. And essentially what Rumi was saying was, the longing that's in our human heart, this kind of longing for something else, what I had labeled as depression, he labeled as a desire to be back with your maker, that you're being pulled back to your maker, you're being pulled home. So this pastor kept saying this line, and by the 10th or 11th time, I just lost it. I just started weeping. And I had no idea what was going on. I thought I was losing my mind. And this woman breaks open the door and smacks me in the arm. I'll never forget it. Her name was Betty. she smacks me on the arm and she says, "Dan, you got to be on stage right now. We've been looking all over for you." I was like, "Oh gosh," and wiping my tears away and running all the way through the light lock and running all the way around the back and running on stage and started playing drums. I was a drummer and I wept the whole time. And then I got off stage and I continued to weep, and I thought I was having a breakdown. And a friend of mine sat next to me and I said, "Man, I think I'm losing my mind." And she said, "No, Dan, you're not losing your mind. This is what God feels like when he moves, and this is what the Holy Spirit feels like when he moves." And that was a profound moment. That was a emergence moment. And I went home that night and I looked at my wife and I said, "Man, the man that stands before you is not the same man that left this morning, and I have no idea why." And I think in some ways, almost 25 years later, there's still that mystery. Something entered in. I believe it is the Spirit of the Lord, but it just has never left. And so that part of Christianity, the way that God moves in the world, is so tangible and so beautiful, but it can be so manipulated, So, but yeah, that was a profound moment.
Yeah. Now, what was your wife's response when you told her that? What'd she say?
Well, I mean, we were both studying Buddhism at the time, so she didn't know, but it started our journey. And you know how it is. People say a lot of things. It's not about what you say. It's really about consistent action. And so I think for my wife, she was married to a moody artist. It was dark. I was struggling with depression. So I think that she was kind of like, she's always been so beautiful and compassionate and amazing partner. But I think she was more like, "Hey, let's see how this works. Let's see how this plays out." And then over periods of years, we start to see real transformation. And that's when we started our journey together.
And then how did you end up being a pastor after that moment? Because you're just playing music on stage for this, large mega church, and then then what happens?
Well, yeah, I won't get into one aspect of this. Maybe we'll get into it later about the indoctrinational thoughts and those kinds of things. But what did happen was, they noticed this obviously, this kind of transformation that was happening. I was pretty known in the area that I am in the Detroit area, as a musician and artist. And so they just naturally said, why don't you just keep coming here and playing? And after about 3 years or so, they invited me to come on staff as a part-time worship leader. Now, I had no idea what the hell worship leading was. I grew up Catholic. You played drums in churches from the devil. So there was I had no idea what it was. But because I was a songwriter as well and a singer, I just kind of went up and started leading worship on a Wednesday night and started doing it part-time. And then then they came to me and said, "Hey, would you be interested in being a part-time worship director?" And so I was part-time worship director. And then in a few months from that, the music director left, and they said, "Hey, would you want to be full-time music director?" And so it just kind of slowly started to happen over a period of time. And then I went from full-time music director into to an artistic director, to an art director, to an associate pastor role, into a lead pastor role. And then by the time I left, I was the interim senior pastor of the whole place. And so it was a strange progression because I never went on any interviews. I never asked for anything. It just kind of played itself out in this place. And a lot of good years and a lot of amazing years.
Yeah. Now, is there a moment when you start to question maybe what you believe, or how your faith is operating in a church sphere, that just really caused you to say, I'm having second thoughts or second guesses about what I'm doing or how I'm doing it?
Yeah, I think it came in the form of having so many relationships with so many different kinds of people. And because of my background as an artist and musician for 20-some years in the professional realm, I was deeply connected to the LGBTQ community. I was deeply connected to the Muslim community and different people of faith. And so when I became a Christian, or publicly started working at a church and became a Christian, I noticed that a lot of my friends backed away. They were very nervous, especially people in the LGBTQ. And I had to really work hard at that to make sure that I was maintaining that, but there was a distance, and I didn't like it. And then what started to happen was the culture is shifting pretty rapidly, and there's a lot of conversation in the community at large about the marginalization of LGBTQ, especially within faith and especially within the evangelical conservative fundamentalist, neo-fundamentalist spaces. They were obviously at odds, and I was in that space. And so what I ended up doing was, knowing some of the LGBTQ in our community, I started meeting with them, and I started having conversations, and I had a desire to have that conversation in a bigger realm. And that was probably 2010. And I started working along with them. I think I was still in the arts department. I wasn't even a teaching pastor at that point. And I started having these conversations, and it started to build. And then I brought in a guest through the kind of stamped approval of the elders to bring in this guy named Andrew Marin. And Andrew Marin had written a book called Love is an Orientation. And he was working with the LGBTQ in Boys Town, Chicago, which is the second largest contingency of LGBTQ in the country, rather than, other than San Francisco. And his story briefly is just he had 3 of his closest friends in 3 consecutive months come out to him. Well, I had a similar thing where I'm in my office and I had 3 different young people come to my office and tell me either that they were gay or they're wrestling with these things. And so really put me on a journey. And I met with Andrew in Chicago, brought him in 2013 of January. And it was a shitstorm, man. Like, it just rocked that place. And he was challenging this idea of saying, hey, man, like, we can go across to Africa and do all these things, but we're not taking care of the people that are marginalized right here in our backyard. And it caused a lot of tension between me and the leader of the place. And we wrestled through it together over a period of years. And I sort of became known as the gay pastor, the one that if there was any questions about that, it would always come across my desk. And so when I became a teaching pastor, then a lead pastor, that was one of the things that really started to rock my theology. How do we create a space where all people can be welcome to the table of Christ? And when you already have limitations for people, but you're not saying them publicly, you're really causing a lot of damage. And that's what I was starting to see, and that's the things that started to really eat at me.
Well, did the church have like an official stance, and then you were counter to that, or they never had a stance, and they're wrestling through trying to figure out what they believed about that?
It was interesting. It was almost sort of the don't ask, don't tell.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the conversations early on that I had with one of the leaders was like, look, it's such a small percentage of the community, we don't really have to address it. And that was literally said, And what Andrew Marin said, which is so powerful, back in 2013, as he was on the committee that was writing the Marriage Act with President Obama, he was saying to us, listen, this is coming down the pike. You guys are about 10 years behind. This is going to be here in a couple of years, a year and a half at that point, because it was 2015, I think, June. He's like, you have to think through these things. And so his whole point was this. There's 3 things you need when it comes to this particular topic. 1, if they call in, you have to welcome them into your space. 2, you have to tell them clearly where you stand theologically. And number 3, you have to tell them what you're doing. Well, we were welcoming everyone, which is what a lot of the big churches, hey, everyone's welcomed here, you belong here, all that kind of, nonsense. But in the essence of everything, we were not clear publicly about where we stood. So it's sort of private, don't ask, don't tell sense. And then we weren't doing anything about it. And so what I started pressing into was we need clarity. I love what Brené Brown says. She says, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. It's kind of that simple. So just tell people where you stand, which they never would do that. And that was a tough one, because you want to lay your theology out clearly for the community. So yeah, I was still conservative in my view of marriage and the way that it played out within Scripture, but I was very, very progressive or liberal in the way that I was going about pushing into this particular topic and walking alongside the community.
And I've noticed that a lot of churches, like, they have those invisible barriers. They're like the all are welcome language. And then they're like, wow, this is great. All are welcome and I'm welcome. Can I teach Sunday school? Can I be on this board? Can I serve here? And then all of a sudden, then they're meeting with the, no, we don't do that here. Sorry.
Right.
And then they have that almost like the bait and switch, like you're welcome, but only to right here. And then you're done.
And that's where I think the most damage comes. We have to be transparent. It's okay. Look, if you have a theology that you're holding on to, and you've based that theology out of your study and your understanding of the historical Christianity and of the different interpretations of Scripture and all those things, we should be able to have those. But number one, you should make it very clear to every person where you stand, whether it's on your website, from the stage, however you do it, it needs to be there. And that's what would happen with us, where we had a lifestyle agreement that you needed to sign for serving, and it had a clause in there, and if you were actively engaged in same-sex relationships, then you couldn't do certain things. You couldn't be baptized. Your children couldn't be baptized. You couldn't be married. You couldn't serve in certain areas. That needs to be clear to the community, and it just wasn't. And that became a major rub for me. Yeah.
Now, let me get your opinion on something. This is something that is not in my notes. But our church is not creedal. It's covenantal, which is different. We don't have a big list of theologies that everyone has to agree to. But that means that we're going to have a diversity of theology amongst us, which then it kind of prevents us from saying we stand on these social issues. Here's where we stand on all these things. So we don't really have the clarity, but we also don't have the barriers, the road barriers that would then, if we have people from that community that attend our church, and there are no barriers to where they can serve because you're allowed to interpret your theology. We have 7 statements, and you're allowed to interpret that with your own conscience. How would this play out in a place that's not so creedal, that doesn't have all of these theological points that everyone has to then adhere to and uniformly agree with? How do those 3 things work out in more of a covenantal aspect of things?
Well, if you wouldn't mind just defining how you define covenantal.
Covenantal it's about how, we are bound together in a covenant with one another in community. And so when you become a member, you don't sign your name at the bottom of a creed, you sign your name at the bottom of a covenant that says, I agree to, be a part of this community and its mission, and to, basically we're not weaponizing our theologies at other people within the community because there's a diversity that exists within it. And there's nothing in the covenant that says, and you have to agree to these social standards, and you have to agree to these theologies, and you have to agree. So we're not creedal, we're covenantal. And I'm wrestling with the issue of how do we communicate this when there's going to be a diversity present, probably like a 75-25 majority leaning towards being affirming.
Yeah.
But there's going to be a 25 of those who probably aren't, but someone coming in won't have those road barriers of I can't serve here because I'm in this community. Those don't exist here. What are your thoughts?
Boy, I've never really thought about it in those terms, but I really like it. And you said, how do those 3 legs of the stool? Is that what you mean?
The clarity and the you got to be clear and transparent with where you stand on this issue, and then you have to. I can't remember the second one. Then you have to do something about it.
Right. So you make clear where you stand, and then you have something active that you're doing in that community or for that particular topic. And I think you can apply this to many things. Yeah. I think in your instance, at least when I hear you explain what covenantal means in your space, that's clear to me. I know it sounds murky to you, but it's actually clear to me, saying, hey, this is what we stand on. We don't stand on this, and we don't, we're here. And because of that, there is a more progressive, liberal, open, however you want to say it, way that we're going to move as a community. It's messy. And people by nature, at least, and I don't want to make this too strong, but I think it's true, and you can push back if you don't think this way, but I think you probably have seen this as a pastor maybe. People love certainty. Mm-hmm. They like just clear lines. Like, tell me what's right, tell me what's wrong. And tell me, if I'm going to heaven, if I'm not. People just want very clear, confident, theologies many times. And I have found in Scripture that there's so much gray area that needs a lot of nuance and a lot of wrestling, whether it's the interpretation of a Scripture, the cultural context of it, all of those kinds of things. So to me, I feel like in what you're saying, it provides such a beautiful opportunity for you to have conversations and you to wrestle as a community, which is what I think we're lacking. In the space that I was in before, in the more evangelical fundamentalist, neo-fundamentalist kind of space, that's based more in certainty thinking. So we already have decided what you need to believe, but we're going to say, okay, everyone's welcomed here, and then we're going to stand up there and tell you what you need to believe in order to be truly welcomed here, and the way you need to behave to be welcomed here. It doesn't sound like that's the case in your environment. And to me, that is alone is enough to put my hands on and go, okay, I can live with that. But if you have in your mind already set rules and you're not saying them out loud, and you already have in your mind the ones that are going to be in and the ones that are going to be out, and you're not saying it, boy, I'll tell you, that is a dangerous place for manipulation.
Yes.
And inauthentic community, lack of transparency. And I really believe that communities and people and leaders rooted in the person of Jesus, they should be the most transparent, the most loving, the most kind, the most radically sharing, the most rooted in mercy that anyone has ever experienced. And the people rooted in the person of Jesus should walk away thinking, wow, what is that? Mm-hmm. And most of the time, I don't get a chance. I don't get a sense that people are feeling that, especially those that have no real context of what the person of Jesus is and what the heart of Christ is.
I like that wisdom. Thank you. We're taking a quick break here mid-show to let you know of an opportunity that Choir is offering. Are you deconstructing your faith? It's tough, believe me, I know, I've done it. But what if you didn't have to do it alone? Imagine having guides like Jim Palmer, Kristen Dumais, Jennifer Knapp, Brad Jerzak, Brian Zahn, Paul Young, and more by your side to help. I know I would have loved that on my journey. Well, now you can. Head on over to choiracademy.com, link will be in the show notes, and register for their Square 2 class using the promo code LIMINAL, and you will get 10% off. This course and community are designed to help you navigate your journey with wisdom and support, all because you're a fan of the Liminal Living podcast. And now back to our show. Now, how did you exit that pastoral realm? What went into moving out of that into something, you started the Open Table Collective. So describe that shift and what that looked like and how that played out.
It started in 2010. A friend of mine, this guy named Jamie Winship, came and he spoke at the church that I was a part of. And it happened to be at an all staff I think it was like a June or something. There was hardly half the staff was there. Maybe it was in July. I don't remember. But I just happened to be there. And he shared something called the Kingdom Circles, something that he and his wife used when they were missionaries in the Middle East for 25 years. And it's this kind of, it's a simple idea, and I'll explain it quickly, but it's like the center circle is the kingdom of God, and then these outer circles are like our earthly identification, whether LGBTQ, Christian, Jewish, Muslim. And most of the time what we do as Christians is we're in our little circle, and we say to the gay person, hey, when you become ungay, and you become straight and you become like us and cross into our circle, we can go to the kingdom. Hey, Muslim, when you denounce Allah and you move out of your, sphere of religion and come to our circle, we'll go. Hey, Jewish person, same kind of thing. And he explained, he says, we don't look at it that way. He says, we're about direction. And so we're not about someone coming into our circle and crossing with us and becoming like us and so we can move. We're interested in not winning people, but walking with them. Mm-hmm. And pointing them into the direction. So it's as if all these circles are just moving towards the center under the rule and reign of God. And I thought, whoa, that makes sense to me. It's considered pretty heretical in certain evangelical circles because it's connected with something called the insider movement. And so it's this idea that you can fully keep your earthly identification, but you can then be rooted in the identity of Christ and be moving towards the kingdom. People like certainty. They want to say, did you say the sinner's prayer? Did you cross the line? You're in. You know, so it's a different way to look at it. So that kind of happened 2010, 11. And then I went through some other different kinds of trainings, and through all of that and the work with the LGBTQ and the work with our church was in an area that had 99 languages, distinct languages, and 5 miles around our church. So working within different communities, ethnicities, religions, I just started to desire a different way, different language, a different way to enter into these conversations. And that just kept growing. And the minute that we knew it was time to leave was when the decision was made that we would not baptize children of same-sex couples. And that was it. I thought, I never want to deny anyone this gift of coming close to Christ and dedicating. I mean, who would say no to a child when you have people saying, hey, we want to dedicate our child to Jesus? No, we're not going to do that. I just couldn't live with that. And so we quit immediately. When that was decided, we quit and walked away in March of 2022.
Wow. That's like a cut and run kind of a scenario. That was probably pretty stressful.
Yeah, it was November was the meeting, announced it privately in December. We said it publicly in February, and we're gone in March.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was nearly 22 years in a place that I really, really still love, because I love the people are just incredible. And it's a great community, a lot of friends, and a lot of beautiful things that we got to see. I just couldn't live in that space anymore. It was too confining. And I felt, what I felt? I felt like God was becoming smaller. And Marcus Borg says something so beautiful. He's like, and I'm just paraphrasing it, but he's like, if you're in a situation where God has become smaller, then something's wrong, because there's always more with God. God is always bigger than we think. It's always more. It's always more expanding. It's almost like as the universe is expanding, ever expanding, God is ever expanding. It's not for our mind to fully comprehend. And so I was just losing the mystery and the wonder. And God was getting very controllable and very small. And I thought, boy, something's not right.
Yeah. I had a similar experience. I've been at this church for almost 6 years. It'll be 6 in February. And kind of the first day at the office, I've been practicing meditation for a long time. And finally, some things just clicked when I had like an interim between pastorate roles that I didn't have words for until I pulled in the parking lot on the very first office day.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't know what was happening, but I just felt no need to convert anyone ever again. And I didn't know how to be a pastor who was not trying to convert and convince people. Like, I was like, that's my whole job. So I thought that I wasn't a Christian anymore, and that I couldn't be a pastor anymore. And I had like a existential crisis, because my entire dogma was about converting and convincing everyone, because that's what evangelicalism does. It's evangelizing people who are not, in the club to be in the club. And that just started a journey for me of really exploring, like, well, if that is not the way to pastor, then what's a different way of pastoring? And I adopted that parish mentality of like, well, I'm going to meet the spiritual needs of this community, whether they come here or not. And I'm not going to, and if people need a worshiping community, they can come here on Sundays. If they need a place to practice Tai Chi, then they can come here on Mondays. If they need a place for the farmer's market, they can come here on Thursdays. And so I started to expand where and when church was happening, from Sunday mornings to, these little classes in community centers, and, that we were making these initiatives. And that's evolved over the last 5 years. And I think it was like the last thing to go for me was that belief in eternal conscious torment. And that's when it just fell off. And I had a moment of existential crisis when I realized like that was my dogma. It wasn't God. It wasn't love. It wasn't, it wasn't any of the things I said was my dogma. Really what was the dogma was eternal conscious torment. And when that fell away, I didn't even know if I had faith anymore. And you say, God is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's like, absolutely. I was just talking with an evangelical pastor, I think a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking theology, and we're tracking, and then his therefore was eternal conscious torment. And I'm like, no, I just can't go there. And therefore God is just that good and that amazing. And I just think that we all make it.
Universalist, you.
Yeah, there's a ton of nuance that, what that even looks like and how that's accomplished. But yeah, we divert on that topic. But then that's when I just really realized, like, when it fell off for me, like, that's the dogma. Wow. That's amazing. Like, it's not really the spoken dogma, the taught dogma, but it works its way, like, down at the center of who you are, and it becomes the dogma, because it's just such a heinous, scary thought to be tortured forever for eternity.
Yeah, there's so much there. There's so many things I want to respond to, because you said so many great things, so hopefully I won't wander too far. You really did. It's so good. This whole concept of winning people, I know that it is based in the Apostle Paul. I know that it is based in some scriptures. It's not just pulled out of a hat. I get that. Yet, what we have really committed to is to not win people, but to walk with them. Mm-hmm. And once we made that shift, and that came from the Kingdom Circles concept, hey, we don't walk with people towards what we believe is the rule and reign of God. What does that look like? And what does it mean to walk alongside people, especially those that are different than you? And I think when that switched for me, there was like a pressure off. And I was like, I don't have to be looking out, having a target on people's backs and going into a conversation thinking I got to wait for my moment to give them the good news. It's just, I can just be with someone, and I can be present and wait on the Lord for whatever needs to happen within that relationship. Because look, sometimes you have nothing to do with that. You're a stop along the way. It's not your responsibility. God has other things that they're moving and changing around, and we're trying to force that. Yet, on the other hand, because I told the story of Mr. Ritchie, I was grateful that he had eyes for me.
Yeah.
And I was grateful that my friends had eyes for me in the evangelical church when I needed something. And so I'm still wrestling with the idea of what does that look like. And I think you're hitting on it by how you set up your community, where you're serving the full community, where you're giving opportunities to walk alongside. And you're not afraid. I'm saying, I can't assume this of you, but I kind of am. You're not afraid to talk about Christ. You're not afraid to enter into bigger conversations, but you're most concerned about how we are to live, which, in reality, the majority of Jesus' teaching, like the vast majority of Jesus' teaching, it does not talk about heaven. Mm-hmm. It doesn't even talk about hell. It talks about what we are to do now and how we are to live and love our neighbor now.
Yeah.
And so I think what you're doing is, you're further ahead than we are, and it's good to talk to you about that, because you've kind of disentangled all these things and then you assembling it in a different way, whether it's the covenantal approach, whether it's the parish approach, whether it's all these things that you're working through. It's inspiring to me to listen to other people that are further ahead and go, okay, how can we incorporate some of these things? Because I think we're thinking this very similar.
Yeah. That whole walking with people. So we had a young couple that called our church, and they said, we're going to be homeless if we can't get this money to put down on an apartment. And they had 2 young kids, and we maintain ecumenically with the Catholic and Methodist Church a benevolent fund. And we said, well, come on in, and there's clear rules on how we use it and how much goes out and all that, but we helped this couple get into an apartment so they wouldn't be homeless that night. And the dad was in the car. He didn't get out because that's just embarrassing that you need financial help, and now you got to go to this church and ask for money. So I get that. And the mom was out, and she's like, oh, well, we're going to be here at church on Sunday. We're going to be here. and all of a sudden they're trying to like earn this money. And I just looked at her and I said, there is no expectation that you need to come to church here to receive this money. Wow. You can just take this money and help your family, and that's okay. I said, if you want to be here, that's another thing. But there is no expectation that that's what you now have to do. We hold this for the whole community, like a business. We brought the business association in on it, and now they donate to it. And so we kind of are the caretakers of it for the sake of the community. I never saw them again, and I'm okay with that. I didn't have to convert them, convince them. I met their need.
Yeah.
And housing is a spiritual need. You need that, and it's also a physical need. And so we just like did that. That's one thing that we did.
So what you're saying is you're living out Matthew 25?
Maybe.
Maybe. Just maybe.
Just maybe. But
yeah, it is a powerful thing. It reminds me of a story that Andrew Marin told our leadership team in 2013. He said there was this church in part of Chicago, and they decided they wanted to open a community center for that region. And the idea was that you would open it up for families to have childcare, and they would do like kind of a co-op. Like you'd have to be part of it. If your family was in it, you'd have to serve or whatever it was.
Oh, yeah.
And so they open up this community center, and they offer, health, or childcare there rather, was like $30,000 to $60,000 a year.
Wow.
So it's super expensive in Chicago. So they're offering this sort of free in terms of how it's going to work. And so they open it up, and all of a sudden, the LGBTQ same-sex couples come out of the woodwork and bring their kids. So the pastor calls Andrew Marin up and says, hey, can we meet? So he meets with Andrew, and he says, hey, man, I got a problem. And he's like, well, what's the problem? And he's like, well, we open this community center. We do this stuff for daycare, and now all of a sudden it's just all gay people. And Andrew's like, okay, well, what's the problem? And he's like, well, they're gay people, and I, I'm the pastor, and I don't believe in this kind of thing, right? And he says, well, was the community center built for the community? And he's like, yes. Is this your community? Yes. Well, so here's the cool thing that happened. So all of a sudden, some of these couples started coming to the church. Now he's preaching from stage, marriage is solely between a man and a woman, blah, blah, blah. And so finally he got the courage to ask this lesbian couple to talk. And he said, listen, you know what I believe theologically. Why do you keep coming here? And they said, yeah, we understand what you believe theologically. We're not there. She said, one of them said, but no one has loved our kids like your community has loved our kids. Mm. And it rocked this pastor's world. That they could disagree theologically, even if he was being clear from stage where they stood. Yet, the thing that bound them together was the way that they loved their children and the way that they provided a community and served them. I think that's a lot bigger than we think. And it allows us to then journey and walk with people that are not like us, which is the whole point, is to have a truly diverse community.
Yeah. I really like what you quote Thomas Merton, who's my homeboy. So it's like we could be friends because you quoted Thomas Merton. Right. And one of my favorite quotes I found on your Facebook page, and I think you really embody this. I want to aspire to this, but you embody this in a way, because I've sometimes when I start talking about fundamentalists and neo-fundamentalists and evangelicals, I can get a chip on my shoulder. I'm working on that. But you have just this compassion, and you're like, I love my roots. I critique my roots, but I love my roots. And this quote from Thomas Merton is, they think, because I critique the system, I'm critiquing them because they identify with the system.
Yeah.
And you've kind of been accused of being critical or hating or being bitter towards the church. But anyone who's had a conversation with you, you're like, I love my roots. Yeah. And you criticize the roots at the same time. How do you navigate that? How do you navigate that with the grace that you do?
Well, I don't always do it well, and I'm learning. So I had a long-term friend of mine, probably more acquaintance now than friend, but asked for a meeting last year, and they proceeded to yell at me for an hour and a half about how cynical I am and how much damage I'm doing to the church, and how could you leave here and say these things. And to be honest with you, I'm pretty vanilla compared to like some of my friends around the country who are just brutal. They just come out swinging. I'm a little bit more centrist in that way. And I remember leaving that conversation thinking, man, like I don't feel cynical towards the church. I feel like there are certain aspects that have to be disentangled from it, whether it's nationalistic thinking, capitalistic thinking, clear theology, all of those kinds of things. And so I started to work on that even deeper this year to say, how can I respond? How can I receive from people that are different from me? And how can I respond? Which is essentially what we're practicing in the Open Table Collective. That's the essence of what we do, is we teach people how to receive hard things, good things. We think reception is very difficult. And you see it in Scripture. In the book of John, it says that God came into the world and the world couldn't receive. Mm-hmm. You see it in the beginning of Genesis, where God gives all of these things and the people take them or they receive them, but then it's not enough and they take what they want. You see this struggle with reception. And so anyway, the way that I've been trying to do this is try to help people see that, hey, this isn't personal. I'm willing to take critique for what I'm doing, but then I'm also going to say the things that I think are harming other people in your theology and in your ideology and in the way that in your practice. And so it's not easy, like there's a lot when you become fully affirming of all people, especially LGBTQ, after being seen as an evangelical conservative pastor, you lose pretty much 95% of your relationships. Mm-hmm. They go away pretty quick, especially in the upper level of those relationships. So that's a sad thing. And I didn't want to swing the pendulum to the other side and create the same ism that I was running from. Mm-hmm. And if we're not careful in the way that we receive other information and respond, we can become the very thing we're running away from. And so what we're trying to do is create a different sensibility that I think is rooted in the person of Jesus. I don't think it's progressive. I don't think it's liberal. I think it's actually the good news that Jesus would take on so much chaos but never give in to the chaos, and then turn that back around and try to bring something out of it that would be redemptive or a gift. In Buddhism, there was a beautiful thing that Rinpoche taught my wife and I, which was, that Rinpoche was the name of the teacher, but it was, sort of a title. But anyway, he would say in this really cool voice that he had, when people are going to shoot arrows at you, and the arrows of life will come and they'll hit you. And he was this little guy, and he would sit there, and he was really intense and really beautiful. And he said, never let those arrows permeate all the way to your heart. They're going to hit you, but imagine them hitting you, then falling to your feet and then becoming flowers. Mm. And I thought, gosh, that's never left me. You're going to get arrows, but how deeply you let them permeate and what you do with them is so important. And how I respond, one of my biggest parts of my ministry and what I'm finding out is people follow what I post, not to even like or make a comment, but just to watch how I'm going to respond. Mm. And when I respond in kind or opposite of what people are expecting, and the conversation turns or shifts sometimes, I think that's a witness to God working amongst us. And that's what I always try to do. I just try to respond in a way that is not from my ego as much as I can. I fail, but try to respond in a way that recognizes the image of God even in my enemy. Mm-hmm. Perceived enemy. Perceived enemy. That's rooted right there in the Sermon on the Mount. Right. Exactly.
Well, I experience you as a very gracious person when you critique the system that you came out of. And so it's surprising. It's not surprising, but it's surprising that someone can experience you and say you're bitter, because I haven't experienced a single ounce of bitterness in this conversation. Even when you're critiquing the system that you know is harming other people, you are doing it from a very gracious place. So that is my experience of you.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I think I'm growing in that. I think, you know how it is when you move further and further away from, it's the wounding thing. Our job as pastors is to work on our deepest wounds, especially our open wounds, because if we can get our wounds to become scars, we can press on them, and other people can press on them, and we don't react. But if we have these open wounds and people press on them, you're going to come out swinging. And I think there will be seasons that I've come out swinging a little harder than others. I think I'm probably in a season now of a little bit more rest or a little bit more peace about certain things. I love the little story that I read recently that I've heard over the years about the two little fish walking to school, and the older fish walks by on the other side and says, "Hey boys, how's the water today?" And they just kind of nod their head and keep walking, and then all of a sudden a little bit later, the one fish turns to the other fish and says, "Hey, I got a question." He says, "Yeah." He goes, "What's water?" And I think what happened to me is I was so embedded in this pool of water in the evangelical fundamentalist kind of mindset conservative land that I didn't realize just how it had permeated every part of who I was. Mm-hmm. Even though I was deemed very liberal and progressive in that community, I was still in that water. And it's not until you remove yourself from that water and you can look back and go, oh man, like here are the good things about it. I love that that contingency of people sort of committed to the scripture. I really like that, and it's formed me. I really like that they go out and pursue people with the love of Christ. I really like the serving part of it. I really like the outward push, and all of that stuff is beautiful. And then on the other hand, I cannot stand the certainty and the arrogance and the lack of transparency and the capitalistic mindset of up and to the right all the time, and to win is to get bigger, and all of that kind of thing. So I am grateful. I wouldn't be here without it, but I'm also willing to say, but these parts of it I can't live with anymore. It's very similar to what you said when you had the awakening about the eternal torment. You can't do it. I can't do it either. Mm-hmm. So now what? Now so you're in a state of like trying to figure all of it out again.
It's like you're living in liminal space. If only there was a podcast
look at you.
About liminal spaces.
It's so funny you said that, because it caught my eye. I didn't even know who you were probably a year and a half ago, and I wanted to write a book on liminal spacing and little spaces, just because I'm in just a massive emergence, convergence, liminal moment in my life. And I saw your podcast and I thought, oh, look at this guy. He nailed it. He's talking about this stuff. I actually believe, honestly, Tom, that the majority of our life is lived in liminal space.
Yeah.
In a Buddhist mindset, they would say that every single cell of every second is morphing and changing, so we're never the same, ever. So like from the beginning of this conversation till now, my body has changed and yours has changed to where we're not even the same person we were when we started, an hour ago. Mm-hmm. That's a powerful idea, because you're constantly living in a morphing, changing, liminal way. And the more comfortable we can get with that and just say, hey, this is life, this is what it is, the more I think we find a peace in that. So I love that your podcast is that. I love that you're thinking that way. It feels very Jesus to me.
Yeah, I've realized, like, whenever I thought I have arrived, it's because I don't have all the information. It's like, right. Oh,
that's great.
It's like it. When we arrive in a homeostasis psychologically, it's just a psychological construct. That's all it is, and it's very comforting to our psychological well-being to know that there's stability and there's things that we can count on. It's a psychological need to know that we have that, stable environment, but it's really not real or true of the lived experience. We really do occupy liminal space. If not all, like much of our human experience is going to be that. and then convincing ourselves that everything's okay. You know.
Yeah, and isn't it cool that the Christian faith is rooted in a core person of Jesus, that his whole life was liminal, that he would leave one space to come to another space temporarily, to live in a body, to, all of these things. It just points to liminality within the very core of our faith. And I think that's, that is something we have to grab onto and wrestle with and try to get some sense of peace about, because nothing is going to ever stay the same. It's going to morph and change. And the more we can embrace that, the more we're going to have some sense of peace.
Yeah. I think what helps and why we need the psychological constructs is because we don't really have spiritual practice that helps us embody ourselves in the liminal spaces that exist. So then they're uncomfortable, and we don't really know what else to do. So then we make a psychological construct of, I need all of this certainty, and I got to have the who's in and who's out and the boundaries and all that kind of stuff. The dogmas and all of that comes in to kind of prop up the lack of spiritual practice that helps us embody who we are in our everyday lived experience of liminality, I think.
Boy, I like that.
So what spiritual practices have helped you along the way as you're kind of realizing, wow, I'm in a liminal spot here? What do you do to maintain? Yeah.
I'm working on that part of my life more and more as I get older. We go through different stages of our life. That your 20s are so different than your 30s and 40s. I'm in my 50s, so it's a different kind of space that you embody, and you go through different changes and morphs, more so, of how you actually navigate it spiritually. I do have spiritual directors in my life, 3 or 4 that I have continual connection with, that help me to be grounded in, things like the prayer of examine, just certain, simple things, silence and solitude, all of the kind of general spiritual practice, whether it be prayer, a reading of scripture, those kinds of things. Years ago, there was a great missionary that we worked alongside of, and there was a cool story that this person talked, where this person would walk through the streets of India where they were leading, and they would talk to themselves all day. And a friend of them finally got the courage to say, "Hey, man, why are you always talking to yourself?" And the guy said, "Oh, I'm not talking to myself. I'm praying." "Well, talk to me about that." And he said, "Well, I try to pray every day, all day. I try to have a conversation with God as I'm walking every step. And I'll say it out loud sometimes. And it reminds me a lot of Brother Lawrence. And, that whole concept of trying to get your life to breathe in 24/7 kind of ways and so I think that's probably my biggest spiritual practice, is to awareness and the presence of God, and trying to be in it with God as I'm going through each aspect of my day. And I remember my daughter, we have 3 adopted daughters, and they're our daughters, but my one daughter said, "Dad, how much do you think of God? Throughout your day, how many times do you think of God?" And I realized, I'm like, oh, I kind of think of God all day long. But I had never thought about it until my daughter asked me. And I had been really studying the Brother Lawrence stuff and trying to understand, like, how do I keep this in front of me? So I think, to me, that's been helpful, that no matter what happens, I can go, okay, how am I supposed to respond right now? Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm feeling this sense of wanting to attack. What do I do? It's okay to feel it, but do I act on it? And so I think that's my biggest spiritual practice. Does that make sense? It's a little...
Yeah, it sounds like recollection, maybe. Like bringing your full experience, your consciousness that's dispersed through space-time geography, and bringing it back and recollecting it in the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of saying it. And I'm not great at it, but it is what I desire, and it's what I've found to be a good practice throughout the day. So it's not like, I'm going to get my morning quiet time. That was always, like in the evangelical world, the nice thing that I actually like about it is it's regimented. So it's very much driven by type A type people. And so they want to accomplish things and put things in order, and everything's got to be this, and it's got to be clear, and but there's something beautiful about that. But when all of a sudden you say, okay, you got to get your quiet time in the morning and you have to read your Bible every day and you have to do this, and you start to set that up, it becomes a form of legalism or pharisaical kind of practice.
Mm-hmm.
It can become that. It doesn't always become that.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of seeing your day as a whole entity rather than just a little half an hour in the morning of quiet time with God.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I've been trying to unspiritualize my spiritual life.
Yeah.
I got a master's and a doctorate in spiritual formation and leadership.
Oh,
and,
wow.
I dove into, Ignatian practices and spiritual disciplines and Lectio Divina and all this stuff. And it was very transforming for me for a good season of time. And then I got tired. And my wife and I, we raise our son, or caretakers. He's disabled. He's 20. And that really takes a toll on your physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual health.
Yeah.
And I found I just didn't have the energies to spiritualize things like I used to. And I just needed something different. And recently I took up, this is going to sound really nerdy and dorky, but I took up collecting antique fans, like pedestal tabletop fans from like the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I'm up to about 6. And what I found is, at first I was just like fascinated. I'm like, these are way better than the fans we buy today. They're just made better. I like them.
Sure.
So I'm like getting them because they're useful. And then I found like, I got to clean them up. There's old people's, not old people, but like the older people who had them, all their dust is in there. So I'm like, I don't want their dust in my house. So I'm cleaning them, and then I gotta, recalibrate them. And I'm finding a lot of peace, like taking apart. It's like a meditative experience to take apart a fan from the 1950s, see how it works, try and figure out how to retune it and clean it and restore it and put it back together and then plug it in, turn it on. And like, there's something so satisfying about that when it just starts running and it's just brought back. And I'm like, this is almost meditative. And I'm like, wait, no, it is meditative. This is meditation I'm doing. This is a spiritual practice, like collecting and restoring antique fans. I sound really old when I say that, but
no, actually it's quite gorgeous because that Isaiah scripture that we are to be people that restore the streets with dwellings, to repair the breach, in a lot of ways, to me, I'm going to be speaking on that in a couple of weeks. And it is actually one of my verses for my life. And I think what you're explaining is the process of restoration. And you're also explaining the process of, to me, when scripture says God is making all things new, that God is tinkering in us and he's blowing the dust off and he's, exposing things and changing things and tinkering with our wiring and, putting a new engine in, or they're, giving us an oil change, or, like those things, the physical, that's what I'm saying. It's like, how can we stop separating these parts of our being and existence as human beings as this is spiritual and this isn't, into holistically, as I tinker with the fan, I'm going to think about how God restores humanity. And that is a beautiful spiritual practice. I love that. And then you can go into all the cheeseball things like, the Holy Spirit's the wind, and when you turn the fan, no, whatever. I'm not going to go down that route. But there's so much to it, it's beautiful.
Yeah, I just was thinking about that yesterday as I was restoring this 1950s fan. And it just hit me like, this is a spiritual practice, but unspiritualized and put in fleshed, incarnate practice kind of a thing. Well, tell me about, real quick, Open Table. What is it? Where do you meet? And how do people connect with it?
Sure. Yeah, you can connect just on the website, theopentablecollective.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, that kind of thing. So we wanted to create a space, but we didn't want to run a church. And so we created, my wife and I and a handful of people created this place called the Open Table Collective. And the idea behind it is we meet twice a month on Saturday night, first and third Saturdays. Every third Saturday we provide a meal for whoever shows up. Everything's done around round tables. we present some ideas and we let people wrestle with them. We call them turning the gem gatherings. So it's from the old rabbinic phrase of turning the gem, where a rabbi would come to a community and lift up a teaching as if they were lifting up a gem or a diamond. And then, diamonds have all kinds of cuts and different angles. So when the light hits it, it refracts and reflects in different ways. And so what we're trying to do is teach people, lift up this teaching. Now you take it and turn it around your table so that each one of you can tell your angle, what your experience is to this teaching. And it is always bigger by the end of the night because we have people report back in and talk. And so that's the Turning the Gem gatherings. We have a podcast, the Open Table Collective podcast, that has done pretty well. And then we do trainings too. So we train on LGBTQ. We train on, we're working right now on a training. In fact, I just talked to someone this morning about potentially talking about living unoffendable. How do we do that? How do we receive well? How do we respond well? And then we hold conferences a couple times a year. So we bring people in, outside voices, Dr. David Gushee, Gail Song Bantam, a number of different people that we've brought in to either have a conference, which we have at a Shalom conference now with Rochester Christian University in our area. And we're trying to do that every year. So we have a number of different things that we do, and then we partner with beautiful places: Royal Oak First United Methodist, Genesis Church in Royal Oak, Evanswood Church, Rochester Christian University, a number of different people that we partner with to really try to get people to love their neighbor in a radical way is really what we're teaching, and how do we receive people and ideas that are different from us and how to respond to them.
That is amazing. You're doing some really cool stuff.
Yeah, we're really excited. I mean, we've had some good conversations with the Episcopal Church, which Amy and I belong to now, Christ Church in Cranbrook, and they're an amazing, amazing place, great leaders there, and they see a great vision for stuff. So it's just been fun. It's been fun to connect with people and to really start to find people like yourself who are wrestling with bigger ideas and leading people in new ways. And hey, we're new to the game and we're having fun.
That's great. Well, I've had fun with this conversation.
Yeah, me too.
This has been fun. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and just sharing some wisdom in your life and all that. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you for the invite. Hopefully it's useful. We always say that, hope it's just useful. If I haven't said something useful, just throw it away. But if it's something good, put it in your pocket. So
I don't think my pockets are big enough for all of the things you gave me today.
Nice. I love it. Thank you, friend.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us on the Liminal Living podcast today for this powerful, wonderful, gracious conversation with Danny Cox. I hope you found our exploration into the work of the Open Table Collective and Danny's journey as thought-provoking and inspiring as I did. If you want to learn more about Danny's work, you can go to his website, theopentablecollective.com, or find him on his social media to get involved and listen to his podcast. All those links will be down in the show notes. And as always, thank you for being a part of this community that listens and enjoys and learns. If you did enjoy today's podcast episode, please consider leaving a review or sharing it with someone who might resonate with this message of radical inclusion and spiritual growth. So stay tuned for next week's episode, where we'll be diving into some more wonderful conversations, getting a little bit political about faith and life and everything in between. Until then, take care. Keep embracing the mystery of the liminal spaces. Don't try to escape them. Live within them. And we'll see you next time. Peace out.